Everyone, please welcome Professor Kimberly Clausing. Thanks for being here. We're excited.
Thanks so much. And I'm just going to share my screen. I appreciate that kind introduction. And hopefully you can see now the PowerPoint. Is that true? I'm just hoping so, but let me know if it's not true, but you should be visualizing that. And I'm going to play that from the start. Okay. So as was mentioned, I wrote a book early, actually, in the Trump administration about the progressive case for free trade, immigration, and global capital. And I think the reason I titled it that, and I'll show you the cover photo for that, was because I thought that it was important to emphasize that not only was there a good case for free trade, immigration, and global capital, but that case was consistent with the well-being of typical middle-class workers in the U.S. economy. So this wasn't a case about serving global elites or helping a particular subset of society, but a case that these important factors of trade and immigration and global capital were really good for widespread, inclusive economic growth. And that's why it has the title that it does. So what I'm going to plan for today's remarks is basically to talk about the argument of that book, but then also to relate it to what's happened since then. So I wrote this book in 2017 because it takes forever to publish things that came out in 2019. It's now 2024. So we've had actually some experimentation with protectionism since then. So I will also talk about what we've learned from those early waves of protectionism and the current policy moment where both the Biden administration and the Trump campaign have important decisions to make in this area. Okay, so turning to the argument from the book, I point out that part of what has created a lot of discontent throughout US society has been this gap between economic growth and GDP per capita, which is a measure of sort of how much we'd each have if we just divided GDP, by the people in the economy, and median household income, right? So GDP per capita is growing strongly over this period. They're both kind of indexed, so the beginning year is 100, but you see a sort of steady increase in GDP per capita. That's enough that each household, if divided evenly, would have had an extra $20,000 like over that, 30 years between 1984 and the 20-teens. Whereas median household income was much flatter. And I think this chart alone kind of points to a source of discontent, which is, it seems like the economy is growing quite nicely, but the typical household isn't experiencing a lot of economic gains. And if you look at recent history, and this doesn't take us all the way up to the present, but it does show sort of two eras. And the bar chart here divides the eras kind of from the period right after World War II through 1980. And I realize many in this audience probably didn't experience 1980 and are entirely lived in the second period. But if you look first at that first period, this shows you the cumulative growth in incomes for different groups in society. So the bottom 90%, which are those first two blue bars on the far left of the chart, had actually the strongest income growth during that post-war period. And growth was slower for those in the top 10%, the top 1%, or the top 1/10 of 1%. Whereas if you look at the later period, kind of starting in 1980, that pattern disappears, right? The bottom 50% see almost no income growth. There's some growth for the 50th to 90th percentile, but over 35 years, the cumulative income growth is under 50%, which is, decent, but not wonderful. And then the top 10%, the top 1%, and the top 1/10 of 1% see kind of astounding levels of economic growth. So I think what we could take from this picture is something in our capitalism has changed, but capitalism itself isn't responsible necessarily for income inequality. We've had a capitalist economy for this whole period. In that first period, post-World War II, there was compression of income inequality as those at the bottom actually experienced more income growth than those at the top. But more recently, we've seen the opposite pattern where income inequality has soared in part because of these divergent income growth periods. So the next big question is, why did that happen? And I think there are lots of different explanations. One explanation is if you look at the earlier period and you compare it to the later period, there was more trade in the later period and less trade in the earlier period. And I think that that's an important explanation that could explain some of this, so it's worth investigating. But I would also point out, before we even get to that explanation, and let's actually, I'll go back and show this picture, that there are a lot of other features of the economy that are changing at the same time. So an important question for us to ask is, because there was increased trade in this latter period, is that responsible? Or are there other factors that are also important? So let me just describe 2 or 3 of the other factors, and then we'll look at the trade evidence. One of the other factors is technological change. And technological change has really been dramatic in this latter period, much more so than in the earlier period. So I know that you probably can't, many in the audience can't remember 1980, but in 1980, our economy was much less computerized and digitized, and that changes the demand and supply for different types of workers in the economy. So we didn't have cell phones. A computer in 1980 was a relatively rare thing. I was in grade school in 1980, and I remember there was a computer lab truck that got brought to the grade school, and you could go into this truck, and there were these giant computers where you might be able to, write some really basic code, but nobody was using computers to type their papers or do anything like that in 1980. If you wanted to place an order for an online good, there was no online, there was no cell phone. You would get in the mail a catalog from Sears, and you could flip through it and you could say, oh, well, maybe I want that shirt. And then you would pick up a phone that was tethered to the wall. And then some number of weeks later, maybe they would send you the shirt, but it was much more common to kind of go to the store and buy things. And so this massive computerization and digitization created some really important labor market trends. Those who could use the new tools of computers to be more productive had their productivity increase, whereas those who got displaced by the computer experienced less demand for their labor. So as an example, if I can type my own papers, right, that makes me much faster than if I have to hand off some handwritten stuff to a secretary who slowly translates it into printed page. And then if there's an error, she has to go back and white it out and try to line it up, so that created a lot of demand for administrative assistance back before computers that disappeared once computers were there, because you didn't need someone to take your phone calls and type your manuscripts and all of that. Think about filling your gas tank too, right? You can swipe and fill it yourself, but it used to be that a person had to stand there and do it and take your money. And, and there was a much different sort of demand and supply for labor. So technological change is important. Market power is important. We've seen a lot of increased firm concentration in many industries where there's fewer and fewer firms responsible for the economic activity. That's been really dominant feature of our economy over this period. We've seen an increase in the importance of superstar labor markets, where there's one person or one subset of people who demand more and more of the rents. You could sort of think about Taylor Swift or Beyonce, because right now we live in this highly digitized, computerized, connected world, right? They can demand much more of the music rents than they might have in an earlier era where people just went out to buy vinyl records and went to attend conferences, because you can download the music and do all of these different things. So there's been a lot of trends: declining unionization, we haven't even talked about that, increased technological change, increased market power, the rise of these superstar labor markets, changes in social norms and regulatory regimes. and changes in tax policy. So we've got all sorts of causal factors that we could say are responsible for this graph. But there's also the temptation to say, well, maybe this is trade or immigration, because that also happened in this time period. So I guess the first thing I would like you to take away is it's overdetermined. There's a lot going on that makes these two eras different from each other, and we're not sure whether it's trade. Okay, so turning to this trade literature, there's a bunch of authors, David Autor and his co-authors, who've used China's entry into the WTO to sort of try to look at trade as an explanation. And they did this very clever study where they took advantage of the variation in Chinese import competition that's geographic across the United States. So you can see, for instance, if you're in Fargo, North Dakota, that there's some Chinese import competition, but it's not as dramatic as it would be in, say, Mississippi or Tennessee or the southern half of Missouri, where there's much more intense, that the darker color is the areas of more intense Chinese import competition. Whereas if you're in Nevada, the Chinese haven't managed to compete with a lot of the Nevada industries. They presumably the traded goods don't displace casino activity and some of the other things that are going on in Nevada. So they use this variation to sort of look at the labor market consequences of the extra Chinese trade, and they conclude that it might be responsible for over 1 million US job losses, and that sounds really dramatic. And in some specifications, it can get closer to 2 million, like depending on how you look at what they've done. So that's certainly a troubling phenomenon. It's not fun to lose your job. There's a second set of literature that also looks at the possibility of gains in job creation due to these extra imports, right? So you might imagine if you're importing Chinese steel, that might make the users of steel more productive because they can get less expensive Chinese steel. Or if you can buy a lot of textile goods from China, then stores like Walmart and Target can sell more of those products and expand job creation. So there's also some offsetting benefits. But that job loss is still real and it's still concentrated, right? And so we might view some of these regions, like the ones in the darker red in this map, as particularly subject to this shock and like worthy of policy attention response. But it's also important to set that in context. So we're talking about over the entire period of the China shock, which is like a decade, maybe 1 or 2 million job losses. Right. Whereas if you look at the US economy, one remarkable feature is that every quarter there are, 5 times that many job losses and 5 times that many job gains. Like job losses occur, which are these that you see the job losses are in the red dotted line here, and the job gains are in the blue solid line. But job losses occur at a really astounding pace, over 6 million to 7 million job losses every quarter, in part because our capitalism is incredibly destructive. Like you can lose your job because Walmart comes to town and you worked for a small pharmacy that gets displaced. You could lose your job because a robot took it and is now doing it more effectively in some factory. You can lose your job because the good that you made has simply fallen out of fashion and something else has displaced it. The good news is that our capitalism is also very creative. Look at all the job gains. Like in most periods, with the exception of the Great Recession that you can see dramatically in this period, in the 2008-2009, there is a period where job loss exceeds job creation. But in most periods, job creation is even stronger than job loss. And so you can pick up jobs in the new industries that are expanding, and there is a lot of job creation in this economy. And if we included these figures to the present day, you would see it continues. Job gains continue to outpace job losses, and our economy has expands in size, and that means that there's lots of new opportunities. And so I'm not trying to say that it doesn't hurt to lose your job due to competition from China, and I'm sure that let's say it was 1 million workers who lost their job due to that competition. I'm sure that was very hard. But what I am trying to say is that we need to remember context here. Even if we say that was 2 million, job losses. That's 1/4, or 1/3 the job loss that happens in a typical 3-month period, and it's spread out over 10 years. So I think trying to say that all the disruption in our economy is due to imports from a particular country is just wrong, right? There's a lot of disruption that's due to domestic competition, technological change, and many other factors. Just living in capitalism comes with disruption. People might say, well, what about manufacturing employment? And I would point out that for rich countries, manufacturing employment tends to decline over time. And this is the picture for the US. If we continued it to the present, we'd see it continuing to be pretty flat. Not vanishing to zero, but staying in the high single digits to present. So if you look at this picture and you're like, okay, well, China entered the WTO in 2001. That's, at pretty far along that downward slope. It's hard to see the effect of China entering the WTO or expand Chinese imports in particular at driving down this US manufacturing share of employment. I think what you see instead is that rich countries tend to move into producing in other sectors, right? And I guess one thing we should stop and wonder is, why do we fetishize manufacturing per se, right? There are a lot of service jobs that are very good jobs. If you're making a Hollywood movie, you're in a service job if you're the one directing it, right? If you're an economics professor, you're in a service job. If you're an investment banker or a lawyer, you're in a service job. If you're a doctor, that's a service job. And some of these can be exported, right? We export education in the United States because when foreigners come to the United States to study, that's a service export. We get revenues from foreign countries for that, right? So having a higher education sector that's doing well will increase service exports. And same with investment banking, and same with many features of our economy. I'm not saying, that manufacturing isn't a nice job. Like, some of those jobs are nice, but I think if I were sort of imagining, would I rather have my child grow up to sew shirts so that we don't have to import shirts, or to do some of those service jobs I just described? It's not clear to me that like shirt sewing would be a better outcome, right? So nonetheless, we might say, okay, well, it's important to focus on manufacturing because it's concentrated in certain regions of the country, and we don't want to make shocks too dramatic. But I don't think it's easy to sort of blame particular trading partners for something that's really a long-term secular trend. And this is a trend that, by the way, China is experiencing right now. They're seeing a declining manufacturing share of employment because they're getting richer. And so they are also moving into other sectors over time. And this is something that's happened in Mexico and Turkey and other middle-income countries too, as they start to transition, and in places like Japan and Europe that have already become rich have a similar pattern. So, trade comes with, some benefits that I'd be happy to describe. And I guess before I get to this picture, let's talk a little bit about whether trade restrictions could reverse this pattern, for instance, could increase the manufacturing share of employment, or could somehow make this blue line higher than the red line. And I would point out that trade restrictions actually come with a lot of costs to consumers that we'd want to bear in mind before we use trade restrictions as, a response to some trends that we might worry about. So let's say, for instance, that I'm worried about the people in the dark red spots. And so I say, well, let's put on a bunch of tariffs to try to help these people. Several factors to bear in mind about whether that would really help. One is that tariffs themselves are a regressive consumption tax. So what do I mean by that? I mean that tariffs are borne disproportionately by those who are consuming goods, and particularly consuming traded goods. And we might think that the poor spend more of their income on consumption than the rich do, right? So if you're an investment banker or a Hollywood producer or even a professor, you can afford to save a lot of your income. But if you're a lower income or a middle income American trying to support a family and get all the bills paid, right, you're probably going to consume most of your income every month or every week, right? So when we put taxes on consumption, those who are consuming pay those taxes. Whereas when we put taxes on income, we're sort of spreading some of the burden higher up in the income distribution, because even if you don't consume all your income, you'd still pay income tax. So we have to worry a little bit about tariffs raising prices for ordinary households that'll act as if it's a tax, right? And it's not just raising prices on imports, it's also raising prices on the goods that compete with those imports. So I think restricting trade isn't a very targeted way to help these dark red spots for that reason. A second thing we might worry about is that restricting trade can introduce new shocks into the economy, and those include the fact that the producers who buy the imports as intermediate goods will see higher prices, and it'll be harder for them to expand production. So let's say you're a producer of cutlery, like you make knives and forks and spoons, right? And then steel tariffs come along, right? It's harder for you to be competitive in the world economy if you have to pay more for your raw materials than your competitors do abroad, right? So you might start losing market share in the steel industry. Or say you're Boeing and you make planes and some of the parts come from abroad, right? If buying the engine costs more than it would have, that's going to make you less competitive relative to your Airbus competitors, right? So we can imagine that these tariffs could also come with shocks to the industries that are producing using imported intermediate goods. And it turns out that a lot of our exporters use a lot of imports to make their exports, right? The same firms who export a lot are the same firms who import a lot. So tariffs will create new shocks in labor markets as well, and that can be quite disruptive. So I think both of those are reasons to be a little worried about tariffs, but there's a third in addition, which is that when we tariff goods, foreign countries respond with retaliation. So we saw, for instance, that we tariffed goods early in the Trump administration, and the response of many countries was to put tariffs on the goods that we sold, right? And that can create shocks for a lot of Americans, including farmers, right? So I had a family member in Minnesota at the time, and a lot of the Minnesota farmers were upset that these tariffs had occurred because the response was to tariff US soybeans. And there's a lot of soybean farmers who couldn't sell as much in foreign markets because of those tariffs. So it was a shock to the US agricultural sector as well. So the concern with tariffs is it's not a very direct way to help those at the bottom of the income distribution or in the middle of the income distribution who are felt by shocks, right? And it's probably not going to change the patterns of some of these graphs if you're hurting some manufacturers with tariffs, even if you're helping others. There's also an international component, and I would point out that when we tariff goods, we hurt the ability of people in other countries to access world markets, and we hurt the world trading system in a way that can be disadvantageous. And I think one of the best stories about what global integration has done for the world economy is the dramatic decline in world poverty that we've seen over this period of globalization. If we kind of go back to 1980, about 40% of the world population lived below the World Bank poverty line, which is $1.90 a day. That's a very stark poverty line. It's difficult to live on $1.90 a day. And in China in 1980, nearly 90% of the population lived below $1.90 a day. If you fast forward to 2012, you see almost nobody in China living below the World Bank poverty line. And these are inflation-adjusted figures, by the way. And in the world, you see the poverty, the share of people living below that poverty line has dropped to 10%. So this is a dramatic increase in well-being for the citizens of the world. It's not entirely due to trade, but if you sort of imagine running the experiment in China or in India or some of these other countries that have seen dramatic economic growth without being able to access world markets, right? If they were in autarky and they couldn't sell to foreigners and they couldn't buy from foreigners, I don't think these types of poverty reduction gains would have been possible, right? It's partly through integration that countries are able to benefit from the world's technologies and the world's marketplaces and to pursue these kinds of growth strategies. So I think we'd be fools to kind of encourage a situation where every country does it on their own. And if you don't quite believe me, you can always try to take a trip to North Korea, right? They're doing the autarkic version of trying to develop without ties to other countries, and it certainly has not worked well for them. And you can kind of tell that autarky isn't a great thing for countries, because when we're upset with them, we often put on sanctions. What sanctions are is just withholding the benefits of trade. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, our first response is like, you don't get to buy our things and we're not going to buy your things, right? It's an attempt to harm Russia by cutting off the gains from trade. So it does show you that there's some benefits to that. Turning to the immigration side of the story, I think that immigration has created a lot of anxiety in certain parts of American society. And if you look at the foreign-born residents as a share of the population, it used to be similarly high as it is today at about 14% of the population. That then declined over some of this same period that I mentioned. There was some wage compression. And then you look at immigration increasing of late, right? And that's also a period of increasing income inequality. And you might say, well, perhaps the immigrants are responsible for that. And if you look kind of at the present year, we're also at about 14. So this sort of flattens out this trend that you see ending at 2015. And if you kind of continued it to now, you'd see, some bumps up and down, but a similar share of foreign-born in the U.S. case. Now, it turns out that immigration, like trade, creates some winners and some losers, but I think it's much harder to find the losers in the data than it is with trade. So in trade, you can kind of point to the China shock and say, here's some people who've really lost due to the increased trade. They may be concentrated in certain regions of the country. There may not be that many of them, but there are some losers. With immigration, it's actually really hard to find the losers in the data. And there have been just study after study of some of these experiments. For instance, there was a brief moment where Cubans were allowed to leave the country. Cuba was a pretty repressive place, to some extent, and didn't allow free emigration or people to leave. But there were exceptions, including this one moment in time where 120,000 people got to leave Cuba, and they all went to Florida, and they settled around Miami, right? So if you were expecting immigration to cause wage effects that are harmful to low-income workers, you'd certainly expect it in the wake of that historical episode, which is referred to as the Mariel boat lift. And there's been a lot of studies of this. And for a fleeting moment, they thought they found some people who were disadvantaged from these extra immigrants. But in careful look at the data and some of the changes in measurement that had occurred, it turns out that, jobs actually expanded in the Miami area. There wasn't a reduction in wages for the local labor force. That may seem counterintuitive to those of you who've studied economics, because you might say, oh, well, more labor supply in a labor market, that should drive down wages, right? Just like more supply drives down prices in a goods market. But one of the neglected factors is that immigrants are deeply entrepreneurial people. So when they come to the United States, they're not just supplying labor, they're also creating jobs. If we look at Fortune 500 firms or billion-dollar tech startups, we see immigrants are a disproportionate share of the founders of those big successful companies. But even if you look at little businesses, the dry cleaner, the restaurant, the corner store, those are disproportionately founded by immigrants too, right? So they have a role in creating labor supply, but they also have a really important role in creating labor demand, right? So if you're thinking about a labor market curve, you've got the supply shifting to the right, you've got the demand shifting to the right. Is the wage higher or lower? Depends on the relative size of the shift. But when you look at the data, you just see absolutely no negative effects from immigration. So you might say, well, why would anyone object to immigration if the data are so clear on this? And I think there are a couple of reasons. One might be they're worried about highly localized fiscal effects, right? So what if a bunch of immigrants are let in in a very concentrated way. They all show up in the same Texas and California towns, for example. And wouldn't that put a lot of stress on those communities? And if you look at the literature, there's a nice National Academies of Sciences study on this. It is the case that immigrants, when they first come in, may make a smaller fiscal contribution to government tax payments relative to services than native-born Americans. But if you look at their children, the second generation who live in America, they actually make a much larger positive fiscal contribution than native-born counterparts. So in a longer period, immigrants are also a fiscal benefit. It's just, but they may still create some frictions and short-run costs in the communities that they join, and that could create some backlash. I think there's also a highly cultural component to this, where people worry about immigrants, in part because they're different. One of the interesting things I've noticed in the data here, though, is that if you look at public perceptions of immigrants, they are the most positive where the immigrants actually are. So this is a map of where the immigrants are, and the bigger the circle, the more immigrants. But if you look at public opinion about immigration, the fewer the immigrants, the more people don't like them. So I think some of these cultural explanations are, a little bit fraught, because, you might think, well, if immigrants aren't assimilating as quickly, or if they have higher crime rates, we might worry. But there's a lot of evidence that they're assimilating faster, and that they actually have lower crime rates than native-born Americans. And that the places where the immigrants are, people tend to value them. So I think, it's unfortunate that we've ended up with the political context where immigration is such a hot button issue, but that appears to be the case. I would point out that we might also usefully distinguish between types of immigrants. There are really strong arguments for letting in more high-skilled immigrants. We have a big shortage of workers who can do technologically sophisticated tasks, but we have really lots of opportunities in the technologically sophisticated sectors of the economy, which is why you all getting an education is so important and will open up so many job opportunities to you. But there's evidence that if you're accepting people who already have skills, that their fiscal contribution is really positive right away. So in the book, one of the things I suggest is that every foreign-born student of a U.S. Higher education institution that's been accredited should receive automatically a green card if they want to stay. And I think that's a very reasonable policy that would encourage, high-skilled workers to settle in America, and because they are disproportionately entrepreneurial, that will also support, the industries of the future. You might say, well, Kim, that's all very nice, but what about refugees? And here I think, again, there are some communities that are overrun by refugees seeking asylum, and that is unfortunate. But I also think would be wise to remember sort of the moral component of this as well, right? These people are often desperately fleeing very unfortunate circumstances. If you read the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty, it says, send me your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. It doesn't say send me your well-heeled investment bankers. So I do think, there's some argument for being open to the oppressed, right? I think we do need more resources to, make sure that the immigration system is done in an orderly way, and that these people can be treated humanely, but also that the U.S. border isn't overrun. And I think there's room for improvement there. But I also think one can demonize a set of highly unfortunate people for political gain, and that's deeply unfortunate, should that happen. Okay, so that's basically the argument of the book, is that immigration and trade are actually forces for economic good. You might say, okay, well, what do we do about this picture? And in the book, I argue that there are a lot of more efficient ways to help the middle class and the lower income people in the United States than putting up barriers, and that putting up barriers is more likely to harm them than help them. And examples of what we could do instead: we can invest in communities, we can provide more infrastructure development and free community college in some of the left behind places. We can invest in wage insurance, so if you lose your job and you get another job that pays less, that the government makes up some of the difference. We can make changes in our tax system to help more those who have lower wage growth, and to take a bit more from those with higher wage growth, including capital income. And I think the tax system has an enormous role to play, and is a much more direct way to help those that are left behind than to sort of demonize immigrants and trading partners. But let me turn to some of our recent experience in the final minutes. And I'm going to try to end by 10 till so that we have some time for questions. But we have done a bit of an experiment on this. We've during the Trump years, we raised tariffs, not just on China, but on many other trading partners. I'm showing you here the Chinese tariffs. And you see these blue lines are the US tariff on Chinese exports. You see some increase on rest of world exports, but not as much. And you see China's retaliation here as well, the Chinese tariffs on US exports rising. So we might ask, well, what are the effects of that? And one thing we see is that US imports from China fell, so we did succeed in importing less from China. And US imports from the rest of the world also dipped down, but then eventually rose to kind of more than compensate for the loss of imports to China, in part because some of the trade that we were doing with China then got displaced to other countries like Vietnam or Mexico. Some question as to how much of that was actual displacement, like the Vietnamese and the Mexicans were actually making the goods that we used to import from China. Some of this might be trade diversion as well, where things get, mildly transformed and relabeled, and the Chinese goods make it in another way. Should we say, well, that was quite good for the US to have done that? Or do we think that that might have harmed US workers in some ways? Well, the first question is kind of like who pays for tariffs? So I've got this like intro econ diagram here, which shows you, how tariffs tend to increase prices and reduce consumer surplus. So those of you who've studied economics, this will look somewhat familiar. And we do see that studies of the Trump tariffs also indicate that, there was a similar price rise as resulting from these tariffs. Every single study, and I've just reviewed them all, has indicated that the burden of these tariffs fell on US consumers, and it usually cost them in the neighborhood of, high single-digit hundreds of dollars per US household. I think one CBO study had it at over 1,000, accounting for some of the macroeconomic disruption as well. But this is the sort of regressive tax effect that I was talking about. You might say, okay, well, that's okay if we got jobs in those left behind regions, but the same authors who did the China shock paper went and looked for that effect and found that those regions were actually often more hurt by the retaliation than they were benefited by the tariffs, right? So if you look, for instance, at the Minnesota example that I mentioned with the China shock, you see there's some parts of Minnesota that are dark red. Maybe they would benefit from those tariffs, but the Minnesota soybean farmers were hurt by the tariffs. And so on net, the communities were actually left worse off. So that's discouraging, and the authors of the China shock studies have concluded that on net this was bad for the workers because of these retaliation effects, and also because of the fact that prices go up when you put tariffs on products. Nonetheless, the tariffs were popular, which is interesting. If you ask those same communities, like, how do you feel about the tariffs? Most of them are like, cool, right? So it's a little bit of a snake oil problem where the instrument itself might sell well, but it's actually hurting you more than it's helping you. So that is a little bit of a puzzle and a political problem too, because then when you put the tariffs on, it's hard for the successor administration. The Bidens, for instance, have not taken off the tariffs. There's been some controversy within the administration about whether that's the right call or not, but they're still with us, the Chinese tariffs. This diagram is so familiar that I couldn't resist pointing out. It's also features on a t-shirt. You can buy it on Amazon. On the back, you've got the tariff diagram. And on the front, it says tariffs not only impose immense economic costs, but also fail to achieve their primary policy aims and foster political dysfunction along the way. I couldn't agree more, so feel free to buy the t-shirt. We're also kind of faced with a big policy dilemma coming forward, which is, do we want to do this again? Trump has promised, if he's elected again, that he will put a 10% tariff across the board on absolutely every U.S. trading partner, and that's an add-on to whatever existing tariffs are, and an additional 50% tariff on Chinese imports. Right, so this would be an enormous shock to the world trading system, an enormous shock to American wallets, right, who would still have to pay for these tariffs. One study found that this would cost about $1,500 a year. I think that's on the right. I think that's a Center for American Progress study. The one on the left is from the Tax Foundation. So both kind of leftist and rightist think tanks are pointing out that these tariffs kind of hit people in the wallet. You might say, well, that could generate a lot of revenue so that we could lower taxes, and it does generate some revenue, but it generates it in a pretty regressive way. So you're kind of moving the tax burden towards those lower in the distribution who are consuming a lot of the income at the same time that you're proposing, more tax cuts for those at the top. So I think this would be a pretty regressive economic policy step. And wouldn't lead to the job creation that we might have hoped. Finally, I would point out that immigration is also an issue. If you look at recent history, I would point out that immigrants, even since 2019, have directly accounted for about 1/5 of America's economic growth. And here's some nice studies that come from an economist who's looked into this. I've got the source at the bottom here, but you can see that they're accounting for labor supply growth, which is helpful, and that's been a growth contributor as well, right? So I think also if we reduce our openness to immigration, that can also create disadvantageous effects for the U.S. economy as well. So I think the economic case is pretty clear that you don't want extra burdens on either immigration or trade. But that doesn't mean we can't improve policy in both of those dimensions. I think the immigration process for refugees could be improved in a way to make it less chaotic and more humane. And I also think that there are ways to try to achieve some of our objectives vis-a-vis national security, economic resiliency, and those objectives without kind of willy-nilly putting on enormous tariffs. I think there are better ways to achieve some of those objectives. So I will conclude with that thought, and I look forward to taking any questions that people have. And this is a pretty controversial area, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Kimberly. We're going to try using ceiling microphones. I don't know, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, okay. So everyone that asked the question, please talk really loud so she can hear you. So thank you, Kimberly, for an outstanding presentation. I agree with you. Very interesting, your presentation. I'll start with the first question. I just want to ask you, do you think that there is a change in sentiment just from the U.S. population to be more protectionist? Because now it seems like, who do you vote for if you want free markets? It seems because I know Trump is talking about increasing tariffs more, and then I saw that Biden is talking about steel tariffs to China, tripling them from what they are now. And so, it seems like there isn't a free trade party anymore. Or is this just a temporary thing, do you think, or you think that just the sentiment is turning to be more protectionist?
Yeah, so I think voter sentiment has turned to be more protectionist. I still think there's an enormous difference between the outcomes based on the next election. So, let's start with that first. Biden has proposed increasing tariffs on Chinese steel. We import almost no Chinese steel right now because the existing tariffs are already cut a lot of that off. So that would have almost no consequence. I mean, I think it probably helps his support in Pennsylvania, and that's probably why he suggested it. That's just my political observation. This isn't, I don't have no inside knowledge of this. But I think that's quite different from suggesting putting 10% tariffs on $3 trillion worth of products, like absolutely everything we buy, and then increasing Chinese tariffs on absolutely everything we buy from China by 50%. Those are enormous shocks, probably 2 orders of magnitude higher than what has been proposed in the Biden case. And I also think the immigration stances are different here too. This isn't to say that I think the Biden administration has the perfect policies here. I don't. I'm on the record as already critiquing them, despite being a former member of the administration. I think they could improve a lot in this dimension, but I do think that it's wildly different from what the Trump administration is suggesting. And I will point out two more quick things. One, that it's different to take off a policy than to start a policy. And sometimes bad policies are adopted. And I would say many elements of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was also adopted at the beginning part of the Trump administration were bad. But most importantly, the regressivity and the deficit creation, right? But those tax cuts are going to be very hard to undo, because once you give someone a tax cut, it's really hard to take it away, because then it feels like a tax increase. Similarly, I think tariffs are popular enough that it's hard to get rid of them, but that's a really big reason not to put them on in the first place, because then you don't have to deal with the political hit of getting rid of the troublesome thing. Although I do think if you put those Trump tariffs on, they'd be so disruptive, there would be demands to get rid of them. A final thing I would just note, the geopolitical moment is extremely fragile and bad right now. We've got conflicts in the Middle East, we've got conflicts in Russia, we've got tensions with China that are quite high. I think it would be unwise to alienate the entire world at this moment with a bunch of new tariffs. And so if you kind of look at the run up to the world wars in the beginning parts of the 20th century, it was characterized by nationalism, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. I think we're also seeing rising ascendant nationalism throughout the world, not just in the United States. And that makes this a particularly dangerous and fragile time. And I would kind of urge all of you to be cautious in this time, and because world wars are not nice things, and that's not what I'm forecasting, but I do think that this ascendant worldwide nationalism is highly problematic, not just for peace, but for solving problems like climate change, economic security, public health, all these other things that we rely on the international community to work with us on.
So now we have time for anybody else that has a question. Talk really loud.
Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very, very informative. I was wondering if you could comment on, so right now there seems to be an open border policy in terms of immigration. You turn on the news and you see that all these unvetted immigrants are just basically walking into the United States. So I'm an immigrant myself. I came here as a student, as an international student, and I went through the whole system. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, the potential economic impacts on the United States from such a rush of basically undocumented individuals walking into the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's ample room for improvement on border security and a less chaotic way to handle the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. So the Senate did refuse to take up, I'm trying to remember which chamber of Congress. We had something where we're almost to a compromise across the parties, and then it got scuttled at the last minute, in part because the Trump administration told Republican members of Congress not to vote for this thing, because rather than provide more resources at the border to protect the border, he wanted to use it as a political issue to beat up the Biden administration with. So I think politics are getting in the way of a solution here, and we need to get past the next election so that people can come together and get back to sensible solutions on the border. But I don't think any impact of that is going to change the fundamental economic reality, which is that even refugees, you give them enough time, they're quite good for the US economy. There's an example I have in the book of a Vietnamese refugee who is the founder of the company that makes sriracha sauce. I don't know if any of you have used that to spice up your meals. But Huy Fong Foods was founded by this refugee, and he named his company after the boat that he took to the United States of America. And at the time, the United States was the only one who would accept him. He was fleeing the regime at home. And he has insisted on continuing to produce this in the United States, even though there are lower cost ways to move it abroad, in part because of his great loyalty to the country over time. So I think we need something that can sort of balance and welcome some people fleeing adversity, but of course we can't just kind of like open the border and let everybody across, because too many people in the world would want to join the United States. It's a wonderful place to be. So we need a less chaotic and more resourced border that can handle one, stopping too many people from coming at once, but also treating those who do come with dignity and respect.
We're out of time now, so we had a little bit of technical difficulties at the beginning, but thanks a lot for being here. Professor Clausing has been really great, so thanks a lot. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person.